Good evening. This is Robert SUNGENIS coming to you once again for the Open Question program set aside for you twice a week, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. to answer your questions, deal with topics of concern to you regarding our Catholic faith, the Bible, the Pope, what's going on in the church today, anything of interest to you in those areas. Here to help you sort them out from what I know, which is not much, but I may be able to help you. And because I've been at this for quite a while and want to share my knowledge and my wisdom with you, so here I am. Now, we've had a lot of questions that I didn't get to in previous programs, and I have some good news. Good news is that I found out the reason why our program was being shut down in midstream. And it had nothing to do with Facebook, actually. It had everything to do with my modem. And I found out that the power is so weak out in this rural part of Pennsylvania that if somebody else in my household turns on the internet, drains the power from mine, and that causes a shutdown. At least that is the reigning theory. So I told everyone to stay off the internet tonight, and we've got 8 other bodies in this house that, are very anxious to find out what's in the world through the internet, as everybody else is. And so I told them they have to refrain for at least an hour. And this will be true for every time we come on. So hopefully that won't happen again. We won't be cut off. So at any rate. All right, so let me see. I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion about some books I have for you. Let me turn around and get them. Okay, so as I did last time, I want to advertise the new book that just came out, Why I Left the Catholic Church, Refuted by Robert SUNGENIS. And that book is about 180 pages, dealing with all the topics that, cover the objections to the Catholic Church. This is a book very thin. I think it's only like $6. And you can get it in PDF as well. But this is good to give to those people that, you're wanting to get into the church and looking for a concise, to the point treatment of objections that come up about the Catholic Church, about Mary, purgatory, indulgences, and all that other stuff. And we get into some pretty heavy topics in here too. So that's available for you. What happened to my other book? Well, I don't know what I did with it, but I do have another book out. This one is Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians, but this was written about a year ago, and I have another one out called Epistles of Ephesians and Hebrews, and I can't find my copy of it for some reason. But that is available also. So Ephesians and Hebrews, that's available at robertsungenis.com or .org, whatever one. I advertised this one a week or so ago for those who want to go heavy into some philosophy and the Bible, the immutable God who can change his mind, the impassible God who can show emotion. Okay? Very important topic, I believe. Gives you a whole new perspective on how we should view God. And I just think it'll help you personally relate to God. One of my best books. So, and I wrote it for the purpose for people to get closer to God, to find out who this being is, and what he wants from us, and why he wants it from us, and all that is entailed in there. Okay, so that's why I wrote it, to strengthen your relationship with God and to know some theology and the Bible. So there it is. I have my old standby. I just took this off here, as always, Not by Faith Alone. The book that started it all for me in Catholic apologetics, available still. And I have another book out called The First 4 Days of Creation, for those like homeschoolers who want to teach their kids what Genesis 1 is all about. All right, if we take it literally. So that's available also. I have, let me see, there's 5 of them here. I have 40 other books available, and you can see them all on, most of them anyway, on, oh, yeah, one more. This is the Gospel of Matthew that I did many years ago, but I have a new edition of that coming out. And that actually is available. And I haven't told Lawrence about that yet, so I have to get that up there. One of the better commentaries that I wrote, because it's got a lot of apologetics material in there for you. So that's available. And I keep forgetting to tell you, but if you feel so inclined, please hit the donation page on robertsongenis.com or .org, and feel free to donate. Okay, that always helps me continue, and believe it or not, it encourages me, because then I know people are behind me, and it makes me work that much harder. So, at any rate, all right. So today, before I get to the old questions that I have missed, and then I'm trying to figure out what I did with that paper. Make sure, yeah, I still have it handy, so after I get to these questions here, then I will attack that. So, well, let me see. Jonathan, Ben, Alan, Kate, Jonathan, Adam. All right, so we're ready to go. Gage is here as well. Okay, so we have Ben. Top of the list again, Ben. How do you do it? He says, hello, Robert. Are the canonizations of saints by the Catholic Church considered to be infallible acts? Also, is the excommunication of a person by the Pope considered to be an infallible act? Thank you. Okay, the answer to both of those is no. So the first one was, are canonizations infallible? There has never been a statement made by the Catholic magisterium that canonizations are infallible. Okay, you can check that out in the Catholic Encyclopedia, both the 1911 edition and the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, and you will find that there has never been a dogmatic statement made by Pope or Council that canonization is infallible. Now, it has been assumed for a very long time that canonizations are infallible. And we might say that well, I don't know if we can say that, actually. See, there is a doctrine in the church that says that what the church believes at large is itself infallible. Okay, let me explain that. So, for example, let's say we had, let's take the Assumption of Mary, for example. It can be shown that the Assumption of Mary, although we have scant evidence in the patristic period, we do have a couple of references some of them indirect, and I think we have one direct reference. But then in the Middle Ages, we had a much more evidence about the Assumption of Mary, 8th, 9th century, 10th century, and onward, right up until the proclamation was made in 1950, all throughout that period as well, in the second millennium. So it was a groundswell of belief in the Assumption of Mary from the masses of Catholics, from the populace of the Catholics. And that in itself, no, I'm not the magisterium here making this judgment, okay? I'm just telling you what the church says about belief in the church that is maintained for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. It not only is maintained, but gains steam as time progresses, okay? Well, the church holds, and this is even in Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, is it 12? Yeah, I think it's 12. Says that a consensus of belief in the Catholic Church by her faithful, that is, by her parishioners, that is supported by the bishops, and that is has a pedigree and a longevity, is itself infallible because the Holy Spirit would not lead the whole church into error. Okay, so that's to be taken into account maybe in a place like this. Okay, now again, I'm just giving my opinion. I'm not the magisterium, but these things need to be taken into account when you're talking about something like the infallibility of canonization. All right, canonization, there were many more canonizations, let's say, in the second millennium than the first, but still, you know, this is a doctrine of longevity. All right, but even though the faithful had a consensus on, let's say, who would be a saint, all right, the faithful never said that that was infallible. All right, so even in that light, that light being the consensus of belief by the members of the church for centuries, even that belief never stipulated that canonizations were infallible. Okay, there may have been strong opinions that canonizations were infallible. All right, and in saying this, we should also say that just because a canonization isn't declared infallible, first of all, it doesn't mean it's not infallible. It just means it hasn't been declared infallible yet. Okay, and it does nothing to lessen the integrity of canonizations, okay? Because all those saints prior who have been named as saints, we accept them as saints because the church has said so, okay? Now, you get into this little hairy situation where if a person who has been deemed a saint and it turns up that the evidence has been altered or that it's been exaggerated or whatever, and that causes suspicion whether this person truly is a saint. And this sort of begs the question, what is a saint? Well, it's two things. One is that the church says that this soul went to heaven. Okay, the soul of this person went to heaven. And that you are allowed to pray to that soul in heaven for faith, spiritual, or any favor from God, to act as an intercessor between you and God. Okay? And since the person would have to be in heaven to be an intercessor, not in purgatory or in hell, of course, hell, then it would be good to know that that person is in heaven if you're praying to them. And that's why the church makes it a legal issue. That is, canonization is a legal declaration of the church so that you know, legally speaking, that that person is in heaven. Okay, so let's say it turns out that the person didn't actually go to heaven, but they were deemed a saint. Okay, well, can you, let me just hold, we got some noise out here. I need to shut it off, so hold on one second. All right, we did shut the window. See, I told them they couldn't get on the internet, so they all go outside and raising a commotion out there. So anyway, but it's not a tragedy if you've prayed to them and they don't turn out to be a saint, which would be very, very, very rare. Okay, but we're not going to cry over spilled milk here. You just pray to someone else. Okay, I mean, if there's plenty of saints out there that we're pretty sure are saints that we can pray to. The church has held them as saints for centuries, so there's really no big deal there. But to answer your question, okay, technically speaking, no. The church has never made a declaration, as far as I know, and I've tried to look at as many sources as possible. Now, we got a lot of pious opinions out there, okay? You'll have some saints, I think Bellarmine, for example, thought that canonizations were infallible. But he's just a pious saint. He is not the magisterium, okay? He did not make, that is if I'm correct in saying that it's Bellarmine. It might be someone else around that time. They all have their opinions, and we can't hold a saintly opinion, a pious opinion, as dogmatic truth, okay? So, I mean, we have to handle these things as if we were in a court of law, because the answer we give, it will affect a lot of people. And so we better be sure of our answer, okay? And that's why we have to go to the level of the legal. Is there a legal statement by the church that canonizations are infallible? There is none, okay, as far as my research has shown, okay? So, now, if the Pope excommunicate, no, that's not infallible either, okay? See, as canon law says, in order for the Pope to say something that we deem as infallible, it has to be made clear, crystal clear, that it is an infallible statement. Okay? We can't play a guessing game here with what the Pope says, whether it's infallible or fallible. Okay? And we should err on the side of it not being infallible if it's not clear that it's infallible. Okay? So that's what canon law says. It has to be clear that it's infallible. All right? And that just makes sense, perfect sense. If it's not clear, well, why is it not clear? Why didn't the church make it clear? Okay? And, so there's a two-edged sword with infallibility. Though it's very good for the church, and it was needed basically to, especially in the time that it was affirmed as a doctrine of the church, 1870, that it was needed at that time because there were so many developing ways of getting around church doctrine. The liberals had basically come out of their beehive in the early 1800s, and they were swarming around the Vatican. And fortunately, Pius IX, the one who made the doctrine, who was very liberal when he first started as Pope, and then the office changed him, and he became a very conservative Pope. And at that time, the pressure on him from the liberal Catholics was so great that the infallibility helped him solidify his authority, because the pressure on him was unprecedented in the papacy, as it had never been before, because we didn't have liberals before, okay? If there were, they came under a different name. The last time that we have dealt with an onslaught of this nature, of the gravity of this nature, that is the liberal movement in the late 1800s, was with the Protestants in the Protestant Reformation. But they weren't liberal. You know, they just had a different interpretation of the Bible from a conservative perspective, okay? And so it was a whole different animal that we were dealing with at that time. But the liberals basically started to rip the Bible apart. And then they started to rip tradition apart. And so this was the new way, basically, to attack. And philosophically, they came and with their new philosophies, you know, the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, and all these supercharged intellectuals that, you know, we didn't have these kind of people before. We had, you know, a few here and there, you know, Francis Bacon or Nicholas of Cusa, a few here and there, but, Martin Luther, but we dealt with them, and quite strictly, okay? Things were not the same with the liberals in the 1800s. These guys were tricky. They were very smooth. They would use the same language and yet mean something totally different. And they were coming through all the cracks that were opened up that the church hadn't closed yet. And so Pius IX, you know, he needed that infallibility. And at least the impression left in the wake of infallibility that the Pope was the supreme authority. He was not just a man among equals, so to speak. Okay, so there was a certain prestige with the idea of a Pope being infallible if he declared himself to be so. Okay, so it came along at the right time. Not that we didn't have infallible popes before. Okay, and this is the other issue I wanted to get to. The Pope was considered infallible prior in our tradition. But it wasn't made a dogma, you see. Now that's an interesting thing. It's like the canonization of the saints. Canonization was considered a final statement of the church that the person was in heaven, but the church never made a dogma about that. An infallible dogma is what I'm talking. When I use the word dogma, I'm talking about an infallible doctrine. That's what we call dogma, okay? So we had infallible popes before, and we can prove this very easily. Let's say we go back to the time of Pope Honorius in the 5th century. Pope Honorius is infamous for writing a letter to a bishop of the East named Sergius, and writing in that letter in answer to a question that Christ only had one will. Okay, one will. Now, why is this important? Well, because Christ has two natures. He has a human nature and he has a divine nature. Two in one. Okay, so would that mean that Christ also has two wills? Because a will is a part of you. Okay, you have intellect, you have will, you have emotion. All right, so that would, raise that question. And it becomes very important theologically. If he has two natures, does he have two wills? Well, Sergius said he only had one. All right. And so there was a big discussion. I mean, once this was found out that Honorius, Pope Honorius, had said this in the letter, and it was in writing, so it couldn't be denied. You had to deal with this. You know, two popes, Leo II, and I forget the other one, and three councils, the 6th, 7th, and 8th councils, which went on, as you can guess, for, you know, probably 150 years. And they condemned Pope Honorius as a heretic, you know, for saying that Christ had one will. All right, but then this just begs the question as to how you size up the fact that he's a heretic with the fact that he's the Pope. And then you have to decide, did he break the dogma of infallibility? Well, obviously he didn't, okay, because you can't break that dogma. So what they understood then was the fact that because Honorius wrote this letter to Bishop Sergius privately, okay, not publicly. In other words, he wasn't making a universal teaching. He didn't command that people obey this teaching. And he, you know, the other criterion that we have for infallibility, there are 4 criterion, and it has to be a doctrine of the church. And this doctrine wasn't defined before, okay? So this was new territory, uncharted territory, as they say. But that was the consensus of the 2 popes and the 3 councils, that because he did not teach this doctrine publicly and demand obedience to it, that this did not infringe on the doctrine of papal infallibility, because that is a doctrine that requires a special set of circumstances in order for the Pope to declare that a doctrine is infallible. And if those 4 criterion aren't there, okay, then it does not rise to the level of an infallible teaching. Okay, it may rise to some other level, but it's not going to be infallible. All right, and this one happened to be fallible. All right, so the opposite of infallible is not necessarily fallible. The opposite may be, well, it's on a lesser rung of authority than being an infallible doctrine. Okay, it might still be true, and the Pope could still say something like that, but it would be on a lower level of authority. Okay, actually, depending on who you talk to, there's either 7 levels of authority in the church, with an infallible dogma being the highest, or there's 10, okay, depending on which theologian you talk to. All right, so what's my point here? I've been rattling on about this. My point is that you had the doctrine of infallibility at the beginning of the church. And in other words, the whole church believed that the Pope was infallible. You can go way back to the New Testament in Acts chapter 15, which is the first council that the church had, and it's called the Council of Jerusalem. And here is a situation where the church is discussing whether new Christians who are coming into the church are required to be circumcised. All right, and this was a pretty serious question, because if you were going to look at the Old Testament as your source of information for deciding on whether these New Testament Christians should be circumcised, well, either the Old Testament didn't address that question, or if it did in an indirect way, it basically said that circumcision was required of everyone. All right, and it gave no stipulation that it would ever change. All right. So if you were to use the Old Testament alone, you might get yourself into some big trouble. Okay. So, you know, that wasn't going to help. Was there any precedent laid down prior to, you know, well, we didn't have a previous pope. Peter was the first pope. So could he rely on some papal precedent before him? Obviously not. Okay. How about, you know, tradition? What could he do there? Well, there wasn't much tradition. The church just started. Okay. So, but yet through all that, Peter gets up in the commotion that's described in Acts 15. I mean, and the Apostle Paul was there, the other apostles were there, all the bishops of the churches that had at least been formed by then, if there were any, were there. The Pharisees were there. You know, everybody was there at this council. James, the Bishop of Jerusalem, was there. And they were having this big discussion. Should we require Christians to be circumcised? And, you know, they're going back and forth, as the first 6 verses say. And all of a sudden, Peter gets up and says, why do we want to put a burden on the Christians, the new Christians, that even our own ancestors weren't able to sustain? You know, we're saved by grace, he says. And he said a few more things and basically made the decision, excuse me. He made the decision for the church, and that was a dogmatic proclamation. He says, no longer will Christians be circumcised. Not that they were before, but he's just saying that the new Christians coming into the church are not required to be circumcised. Okay, this became a big to-do because almost every epistle, Paul has to deal with this group called the Judaizers, who were insisting, even after the council had decided that there would be no more circumcision, they were insisting that the Christians circumcise. And Peter himself got into trouble a little bit with that because he was treating the Gentiles, you know, differently than he was his Jewish brethren. And Paul caught him. That's in Galatians chapter 2. But prior to that, you know, Peter, when he is led by the Spirit of God, let's say, stands up, gives us this doctrine that there will be no more circumcision, and that is an infallible declaration by the Pope. Okay, and we have held that ever since. So for 2,000 years, no Christian has ever been required to be circumcised. You see, that's how it works. And so that was early on. So those are just 2 examples we have of papal infallibility. The one we have with Honorius and the one we have with Peter. And then if you read all the letters of the church fathers, I mean, they're constantly writing to the Pope asking him for authorization for this, for that, and the Pope gets his final decree and they abide by it. All you got to do is read these the letters that the fathers exchange with Rome, and you'll see it all over the place. So it's real. And again, the point we want to reiterate is, even though the church practiced this and believed the Pope was infallible, there wasn't a reason to make it an infallible doctrine itself, papal infallibility, until many years later, 1,870 years later. That's when it was necessary. Okay, and the Pope decided that, and he did it. A few sessions ago, I think we talked about the canon of Scripture. The canon of Scripture was accepted as the same we have today. Excuse me. The First Council of Rome in 380 AD. Okay, the Pope approved that council, and that council had the same 73 books that we have today in our Bible. But it wasn't an infallible statement. Okay, that infallible statement on the canon of Scripture didn't come until the Council of Trent. 1,500 years after Jesus and the apostles, and 1,200 years after the Council of Rome. Okay? So, as we said, I think I said before, there's a lot of doctrines that are in the lumberyard of the church that remain there for centuries until the church says that now is the time. Now is the time to address this. And she will do that when the pressure is on. Okay? Why do we have the doctrine of justification made into infallible dogma at the Council of Trent? Well, because now was the time. Because Martin Luther raised his ugly head and challenged the church on the very doctrine of salvation. And so the church had to sit down, get all she knew from tradition and from Scripture, and formulate her canons. And that was the time to do it, not before, okay? Because it wasn't an issue before. People just believed. They believed what the church taught them. And there was no question about that. Dogma only comes about, usually, when there's a controversy, a major controversy, okay? So that's how that works. All right, I think I spent long enough on that one. Too long, actually. Okay, Jonathan says, hello, Dr. St. Jonas, can you discuss the change of worshiping on Sunday versus the Sabbath and a refutation of the SDA church? I assume SDA means Seventh-day Adventists. All right, here's an easy one, okay? It's easy. And I'm glad you asked this question because so many people are confused about this issue. And once you see the key, then you can answer this, Saturday worship that they insist upon. All right, so we have Moses, right? Moses is given the law. Let's call it the Mosaic Law. So, and in that law, what do we have? We have three different kinds of laws. We have the moral law, okay? So, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's a moral law. Thou shalt not steal, okay? The moral laws cover relations with men. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, okay? So the last 7 commandments are dealing with the moral law, okay? From honor your father and mother all the way to thou shalt not covet. The first 3 deal with worshiping God, okay? And then there are details to those first 3 commandments in the ceremonial law of the Mosaic Law, okay? So, we aren't to take the name of our God in vain, and then there was all these stipulations as to how that's to be obeyed in the ceremonial law, okay? Then there was the Sabbath law, okay? And then there were all kinds of stipulations in the ceremonial law, how that was to be obeyed. You had a Sabbath every Saturday, but you also had Sabbaths on special times of the year, okay? And there were certain rules that applied to when these Sabbaths would come about. And then you also had the third part of the Mosaic Law is the civil laws, okay? So, when it says thou shalt not commit adultery, well, then you had a whole set of civil laws underneath of that required you to do certain things if you were found in adultery. Okay, so for example, if you were found in adultery by 2 or 3 witnesses, and you were, let's say a woman was found caught in adultery by 2 or 3 witnesses, and that was adjudicated and affirmed by the court, okay? then that woman would be executed. Okay, that was a capital crime. Civil law required that she be executed. Okay, now let's say that she was committing adultery, but there weren't 2 or 3 witnesses. But everybody suspected that she was committing adultery. It just didn't have the solid proof of the witnesses. Okay, well, in that case, Numbers 5 said that she would be forced to go see or her husband had the right to take her to the priest, and he would make this potion. And I shouldn't call it a potion. It's some kind of concoction that he made, and he would make her drink it. And if she had committed adultery, then it says her thigh would rot. And what that means in a sexual euphemism is that she would not be able to bear children anymore. Okay, that's what that means. Thigh rot. The thigh is the closest to the genital organs, and they would made to be inoperable. All right, but she would still live. That is because you couldn't stone her unless you had the 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, so that's the civil law. All right, so let's just wrap this up. In the Mosaic Law, you have moral laws, you have ceremonial laws, and you have civil laws. Okay, now the question is, and let's say that's the Old Covenant. Okay, now the question is, what happens to the Old Covenant when Jesus comes? Well, the Old Covenant is revoked, set aside, abolished. Okay, the Old Covenant. We're talking about the Mosaic Covenant now, in its 3 forms: moral, civil, and ceremonial. Okay, now here's where some people make the mistake. They say, well, Mosaic Law was revoked, but the moral law of the Mosaic Law persisted. Okay, and that's why we have the 10 Commandments today. No. Okay, no. That is the wrong way to look at it. When the New Testament says that the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, has been revoked, and it says it several times, all right, Colossians 2:12, Ephesians 2:14 and 15, Hebrews 7 verse 18, Hebrews 8 verses 1 to 13, Hebrews 10:9, and other passages as well. Okay, so it's crystal clear in the New Testament that the Old Covenant has been revoked. All right, but here's what we have to understand from that: that when the Old Covenant is revoked, that means the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial laws of the Mosaic Covenant have been abrogated. They have been revoked, all of them. The whole law has been revoked. Now, someone will say, well, then why does Paul teach to obey the 10 Commandments? Okay, like in Romans 13 and in Galatians chapter 5. Well, that's because the New Covenant has the right to take anything it wants from the Old Covenant and put it into the New Covenant. And so now those laws are under the jurisdiction of the New Covenant. You see, because you can't have 2 covenants working. They can't compete against one another. All right? The New Covenant takes over in toto. All right? And it has its own moral laws, civil laws, and ceremonial laws. Okay? So the moral laws that were in the Old Covenant, where do they come from? They came from God. They were basically eternal laws. That's why it's always wrong to commit adultery. It wasn't just wrong in the Mosaic Covenant. Okay, so the Mosaic Law itself took the eternal law of God and put it in the Mosaic Covenant. All right, And the New Testament can do the same thing. It take that eternal law of God and put it in the new covenant. All right. But what we need to understand is once the new covenant replaces the old covenant is dead. It's over. And the only thing it's good for now is to take information from it that was good. Okay. And Paul says this himself in Romans chapter 7, that the law is good. Okay. Because it's from God and it tells us to do the right things. All right. But the New Testament says that it's only going to take certain laws, the ones that will benefit the new covenant, not the old covenant. Okay. So what ones benefit the new covenant? Well, certainly don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie. They're all beneficial for the new covenant, aren't they? Yes. How about the one about the Sabbath? Well, that was revoked because that was part of the old covenant. Okay. Along with every other ceremonial and civil and moral law, the Old Testament law to obey the Sabbath was also revoked. So unless the new covenant picks that back up, then there is no Sabbath law to obey any longer, because the old covenant in toto has been revoked. So that's why in Romans 13, when we have Paul listing the commandments that we're to obey, which one does he leave out? You guessed it. The third commandment about obeying the Sabbath. Okay. Why? Well, because the church decided that was not going to be practiced in the new covenant. And so that's why we find in Acts 20, verse 7, for example, that the church, the Christians, met on the first day of the week, not the seventh day of the week. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, we find the same thing, that collections for the church in worship are to be taken on the first day of the week, not the seventh. As a matter of fact, there is never one mention of the seventh day in the New Testament, except in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, when the writer is talking about the symbolic nature of the seventh day from creation. On the seventh day, God rested, and now your rest is in Jesus Christ. So he's using a metaphor and an allegory to teach them about salvation. Okay, that's the only time in the New Testament. So obviously the New Testament isn't picking up seventh-day Sabbath worship. It's actually excluding it. Okay, and can it do that? Well, yes, because they're under a whole new jurisdiction. They're under the new covenant. They're not under the old covenant. Because why? Because the old covenant in toto has been abrogated. Okay, and the same with the ceremonial laws, let's say circumcision. That was done away with. Okay, we just talked about that in Acts chapter 15. How could they do that? Because the whole law was done away with. All right, and only those laws that the church deemed beneficial were going to be practiced by the church. Okay, and the moral laws, almost all of them were taken because they're all good. Most of the ceremonial laws were done away with because they were just rituals. Okay, and then those that weren't taken away, the sacrifices basically were turned into, the sacrifice of Christ. But even there, we have to make a distinction, because Hebrews is very clear that the priesthood of Jesus Christ did not come from the Levitical priesthood. Okay, and that's another mistake people often make. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross was a continuation of the Melchizedek priesthood, another priesthood that God created long before the Levitical priesthood. And so even our priesthood does not come from the Levites. You would think that would be the natural place. It doesn't. It comes from the priesthood of Melchizedek. And that's what our Catholic priests are following, the priesthood of Melchizedek, not the Levitical priesthood. All right? So there's another instance where the church decided we're not taking the Levitical priesthood. Okay? because our whole sacrifice is different now than it was in the time of the Levites and the Israelites. Okay, so this is how you answer a Seventh-day Adventist. All right, you show them all the passages in the New Testament where it says the old covenant has been revoked. Not half revoked, not 99% revoked, all revoked. And Paul uses very strong Greek words to get that point across. Okay, abolished, abrogated, things like that. All right, that's what you need to know. Okay, so I answered that question, and if you have any other questions about that, let me know. Adam says, greetings, Dr. SUNGENIS, could you please clarify how exactly the dogma of extra ecclesiam nulla salus is to be understood? Also, is the idea of a partial communion legitimate? If so, what bearing does it have on the dogma? I'm not sure what you mean by partial communion. Maybe you'll have to write in and elaborate on that. I've never heard that phrase used before. At least I don't remember it. But as far as extra ecclesiam nulla salus, look, this is a church doctrine, okay, by Boniface VIII in the 1300s. And then after him was Eugene IV, who laid down something similar. Okay, this is Catholic dogma, that only inside the church can you be saved, okay? And this must continue to be preached because that doctrine does not change. And those are two infallible doctrines, okay? Now I wanted to say something more about infallibility, papal infallibility, but I don't know if I want to get off the track here. So I'll save it for the next time because we only got 5 more minutes left. So their dogma. Now, those two dogmas were written during a time, and it's always good to look at the context, the historical context. Why were these doctrines given at that time? Okay, extra ecclesiam nulla salus by Boniface VIII. Well, at that time, you had some controversy. Okay, the Jews, for example, had been in Babylon for 1,000 years. Okay, once they were dispersed from Jerusalem at the final stages in 136 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt had been overturned by the Romans, there were no more Jews in Israel. They had been dispersed to Babylon. They went there for 1,000 years. And then they started to migrate to Caesarea in southern Russia around 1000 AD, okay? And then as they grew in Caesarea, then they started to migrate to Eastern Europe. And around the 1300s and 1400s, they became a prevalent part of society. And, you know, they were still of the opinion that they were the chosen race and that God still had great plans for them. And you know what comes with that. That is that, you know, we don't need the Catholic Church in order to be saved. We have our own religion. We're reviving it from the ancient past, you know, from the time of Abraham and Moses and blah, blah, blah. So they became a competition for the church, the Jews did, around this time. And that's why Boniface VIII and Eugene IV mention Jews specifically. And they say, you know, heretics, Jews, schismatics, blah, 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 you know, cannot be saved unless they bow to the Roman pontiff of the Catholic Church. Okay, so heretics, definitely, but there was even a problem back then because now you had so many factions being created that you didn't have before. You know, you had the Albigensians, you had all kinds of groups being created, even in that early time, before the Reformation period. The church had to deal with it. So, you know, an Albigensian would be a heretic, but the Albigensian would claim that, you know, he's right with God because the church is wrong. All right. So, you know, you had to make it clear. If you've been deemed a heretic by the church and excommunicated, you are not going to heaven unless you come back to the church. Okay. And the same problem with schismatics. You know, by this time, you know, everybody was beginning to feel their oats by this time. And in the second millennium, that was not as true in the first millennium. And, you know, these people who think that they could just, you know, pack their bags and leave the church and still be right with God, forgetting the fact that the church is a physical institution as well as it is a spiritual institution, and that you must remain within that physical institution and not just spiritual. See, that was an idea that's being floated around, especially by the Albigensians, you know, that you just have to belong to the spiritual church, so to speak. And then the Protestants picked up on that, you see. It doesn't have to be physical. It just be spiritual, and we're all members of the spiritual church. This sounds real good, you know, because we know there's a lot of wicked people in the church, as even we have today. Okay. So, but that's not the case. You see, Jesus built a physical church as well as a spiritual church. Both are required. And so you were getting a lot of people at this time, you know, saying, well, we don't have to be members of the Catholic Church. Come on. The world is getting too big. And, you know, the church can't accommodate everybody and blah, 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 and all this stuff. All right. So that's why that doctrine was made, because there were many people saying that they didn't need the church to be saved. And the Pope came down and said, yes, you do. Nothing has changed in that regard. We are responsible for your souls. The hierarchy, we're responsible for your souls. And if that's the case, then you have to be under our jurisdiction. We have to tell you what's right and wrong. We have to give you the sacraments that give grace to your soul. There is no exceptions to any of those. And the only way you can get those, you and your children, is to be members of the Catholic Church, you see. So it all fits together very nicely. That's why that doctrine is very, very important, all right? And of course, you get in discussions, and these will be never ending, about, you know, what happens to the man in Africa who never hears the gospel, never hears about the church? What happens to him? Okay. Well, there's two answers that Pius IX gave us. One is, we don't know the answer to that question, okay, and to proceed any further is not wise. He said that. And then he also said that in cases where there is a man who hasn't ever heard of Christ or the church, lives a decent life and obeys the commandments, he can attain eternal life. It's not guaranteed to him. Just theoretically, it is possible for him to attain eternal life because of the grace of God. All right. And that's where he left it. All right. So question done. We've been there, done that. All right. But that really has nothing to do with extra ecclesiam nulla salus. The extra ecclesiam nulla salus is dealing with those people who basically stand up and say, we don't need the Catholic Church to be saved, to get to heaven. All right. Those are the cases it's dealing with, not the exceptions to the rule out here on the fringe somewhere. All right. And that's why that doctrine is needed. Okay. So, yeah, I don't think there's anything much more to say about that. But what is important is you look at the whole context of that question to get a grasp of why this doctrine is so important. Okay. All right. So it is 8 o'clock. Time to quit. And if I didn't get to your question, come back tomorrow. I'll be here between 7 and 8. And make sure you're first in line. Beat Ben Emerson. He's always there first in line. You got to get your question in before him. And I'll be glad to help you out then. Okay? So it's been nice being with you. God bless you. And may he keep you safe until tomorrow. Bye-bye.